So my first question for you, Jeremy, we presented the tools, mindsets, and processes of systems thinking in a color evasive way. And that was some of the feedback that you offered us on Twitter. So can you just talk more about color evasive as a concept and how it's harmful to efforts for racial equity and justice in education?
So the first point, just around color evasion, color evasiveness, a lot of people have heard about this term, and it's formerly or still currently discussed as color blindness. When people say, I don't want to talk about race, I don't think I need to talk about racism, why are you inserting race into the discussion? Why can't we all just be colorblind, right? I really like the lingo color evasive. I think it marks a more active stance, because I think while we talk about, oh, I don't want to talk about race, when we say color evasive, we actually can see how through our learned ways of thinking, many of us, and myself included, we're taught to not discuss race, to not discuss racism, because it's in the past. We had the civil rights movement, laws were made. Now, what are we talking about? Everyone is equal. And I think just in the last couple of years, there's a lot of folks who have started to have their eyes open to the fact that there's clearly inequities, racial injustices that persist. They've always persisted. And so I like the idea that we can talk about color evasion, because when we have the chance to speak the truth about any subject, race is a major core element to a lot of those things, especially in the United States. And so when we are neutral, when race is clearly on the table for a lot of people, my view is that that is color evasive ideology. We do a lot of workshops on the idea around color evasion, color blindness. Color blindness can also be deemed an ableist term. We don't want to associate blindness with something negative, and that's also part of our own reflection that we could be doing to have more inclusive language. But in terms of color evasion, color evasiveness, I always think about what's the first time you thought of this term, and does it have a positive or negative association? And a lot of people say it's a positive association, right? I want to treat everyone the same. I want to treat everyone equally. And we can actually think about one of the most sort of poorly rated Supreme Court cases of all time, which was Plessy v. Ferguson in the very late 1800s, where the dissenting opinion that wound up being on the right side of history said, I do not agree with this Supreme Court decision to say that separate but equal is the law of the land. And in that dissent is one of the first times it kind of becomes popular to sort of say that the law should be colorblind. It should treat everyone equally. And sort of in pop culture, it becomes more of a liberal thing to say, a more progressive thing to say that, I should just be colorblind. And I think when you ask people about color evasiveness, people think about Martin Luther King Jr., right? And people say, that story of little children holding hands and race shouldn't matter, and just sort of want to end there. And I think the reasons why color evasive ideology is so harmful is because, to be honest, and I can reflect personally on this, is that it conveys a false reality about the world, right? It's a convenient narrative to maintain the comfort of people who often benefit from systems of oppression to say, why are we talking about race? We already handled this decades ago. Why can't we just be judged on our character, on how hard we work? And I think that when you talk to any racial scholar, there's just decades, hundreds of years of research to sort of go against this line of thinking, because whether or not you intend to use it, it is following the lead of folks, a lot of people who would rather not deal with issues of privilege, issues of inequity, because it sort of goes hand in hand with this idea that we should all be able to just pick ourselves up our bootstraps, that everyone should be able to do what they achieve, and we shouldn't even talk about the systemic or structural policies that have always been in place that have oppressed some and benefited others. And so I think when I really think about this concept of any product, any conversation, when race is apparent for a lot of folks, and then you opt to say, why are you adding race to that equation? One, that of course shows sort of your own racial consciousness in the conversation, an ability to listen to the experiences of others, but also I think really it's sustaining a sense of validating this mentality that you should just be working hard and you can achieve whatever. There's no other forces there. And it cuts deep because it's about people's sense of self-worth, regardless of privilege, right? If I am going to acknowledge that there were systems that maybe gave me a little bit of a leg up over another, then that's really deep. And it's a core question of who I am. And I think as a white and Asian person, my role has been to say, we can still uphold our sense of self-worth as people and also acknowledge the brutal truths of the history of this country, of colonization, of enslavement, of discriminatory practices that still exist, and be on the right side of history by first talking about race and racism.
Yeah, I think I like your reflection about color evasive being a more active stance. It's something that any of us have to choose to do. And I think it's interesting when applied to any of the work that any of us do. And what's interesting to me is I often hear colorblind, and I also appreciate the recognition of the ableism within that term. I traditionally hear that applied to individuals. When we're talking bigger sort of systems, policies, disciplines like systems thinking, the term that I often hear is race neutral, which I think color evasive is more explicit because it acknowledges that there really isn't anything that is race neutral in this country right now. That's a mislabeling. Because it doesn't talk about race doesn't mean that something is race neutral. It would still have impacts.
Right.
As it applies to race and racism. So I appreciated your use of that term in the feedback and in my reflections on it. I do think that it's really helpful. And I think the other thing that you just said that is standing out to me is that idea of when race is clearly on the table. Because it was clearly on the table as we were writing this piece. We used an example of a group of students and parents and teachers really grappling with the discipline policy in their school and the disproportionate ways that Black students were being harmed by those discipline policies. So race was obviously on the table as we were writing the piece. In the framing of the tools and in our offering of how you might use these as an education stakeholder, we didn't explicitly think about how these tools might be useful to you as you are looking at the systems of oppression of the racist structures that exist in your schools. So I feel like there were some not too difficult ways that we could have been more explicit in the framing that would have been more aligned with some of our thinking about the value of some of these tools. So I think that those are a couple of important reflections from me based on what you've shared.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also hard too because race neutral, sort of in a legal sense, is an accurate term because it's a way to sort of avoid using race when often race is the goal, or there's disparate outcomes that happen when people are trying to get around lawsuits. And so I think there is a place to sort of say this is neutral, but I really like your reflection. I think that even in creating any product, or sort of any guidance that can help others. I think especially when the examples are about racial equity, when racial equity and anti-racism is the thing that right now everyone is talking about. And I really pray that never goes away and that it's not just, that year, right, when everybody was focused on that, but that when that is such a part of a product, I just sort of felt too that in sort of entitling it, in framing it, in getting people to even buy into it, there is an urge to want to be more inclusive, but sometimes be more inclusive for people's viewpoints because a lot of people are scared to talk about race and are worried that it might reflect other conversations that they've had, which maybe haven't been great for their own sort of either defensiveness or just sort of lack of comfort in discussing some of these things. So I understand where it might come from, but I really appreciate your reflection around that.
Yeah, and what is it that we're protecting and who are we protecting in being, as you say, more inclusive, which is in some cases then leading things to be more exclusive or at least continuing a level of exclusion in conversation and in sort of whose priorities and needs are put at the top of the list. Are we prioritizing people's comfort over the actual need to change our systems?
Right.
So I think that's an important point.